There is a man underneath a car that costs more than he makes in a year. His hands don't shake. They never shake. They move through steel and pressure and heat with the kind of precision that isn't taught in any classroom, the kind that gets built in places where being wrong means people don't come home. The shop around him is loud. He doesn't hear it. Then the footsteps stop. A shadow falls across the concrete floor and doesn't move. He slides out, stands, doesn't wipe his hands. The woman looking at him has never once in her life asked permission for anything. Her voice, when it comes, is quiet, controlled. The kind of quiet that doesn't need volume to be final. The entire shop goes still. He says 3 words. She walks away. And somewhere over Atlanta, a Navy helicopter has already changed course. The morning smelled like burnt coffee and motor oil, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from one bad night, but from 3 years of them stacked on top of each other like unpaid bills. Anthony Wilson was already under the SUV when the rest of the crew clocked in. Not because he had to be, because the transmission wasn't going to diagnose itself, and because the faster he finished, the more he could bank toward the 340 Zara's pulmonologist wanted for the follow-up appointment next month. Simple math. Brutal math. The only kind he did anymore. He heard their footsteps, recognized each one without looking. Harold's slow dragon plant from the hip replacement 2 years back. The younger guy's voices still rough with sleep, sneakers squeaking on the concrete. The sharp click of dress shoes that didn't belong on a shop floor. He stayed under the SUV. The vehicle was a current year, Mercer certified pre-owned, $87,400 sticker price, and whoever owned it had been running it with a transmission fluid leak for approximately 4 months, based on the oxidation pattern on the pan gasket. Anthony could smell the burn before he even touched the dipstick. 3 seconds under the hood, 2 seconds listening to the idle. He already knew. He always already knew. Except knowing and getting paid were 2 different things. He positioned the pressure gauge. Not the one from the company toolkit, his. The one from the olive drab box in the corner of his workstation. The one with the NATO stock code barely visible under years of wear. The one he'd carried through environments where a wrong reading didn't mean a comeback appointment. It meant someone didn't come back at all. He'd learned this test in conditions that made a Tuesday morning in Atlanta feel like a dream. High humidity, salt air, rotors overhead, colleagues who trusted the number he called out with their lives, not their warranties. The gauge read what he already knew it would read. He made a note on his pad, started disassembly, and that was when the shop went quiet in that specific way it did, when someone important walked in. Not loud important, consequence important. The kind of quiet that travels through a room before the person does, like a weather system announcing itself. Anthony didn't look up. He heard her stop. 3 feet from his workstation. He knew the distance because he had spent years calculating distances without looking, a habit that did not retire just because he did. Sandra Mercer stood above him and said nothing for 4 seconds. He counted. Then, "What are you doing?" Not a question. A verdict looking for paperwork. He slid out from under the vehicle, stood. Didn't wipe his hands first, because there was no point wiping his hands. They'd be dirty again in 30 seconds. He looked at her directly, because he'd also learned that looking away reads as guilt, and he had no guilt about what he was doing. He had been doing it correctly for 11 years before he ever set foot in this shop. Sandra Mercer was 31 years old and carried herself like a woman who had decided very early that the cost of being underestimated was higher than the cost of being feared. She was in a dove gray suit that probably cost more than Anthony made in 2 weeks. Her black, loose waves hair, catching the overhead fluorescent light with a natural sheen, parted slightly off-center in a way that said effortless but meant deliberate. She was looking at his gauge, then at his hands, then at the gauge again. That's not in our services manual. It's a hydraulic pressure differential test, modified for... I know what it is. It's not in our manual. He stopped, recalibrated. Would you treat them with kindness? Because there was a version of this conversation where he explained the accuracy differential. where he walked her through the field adaptation, where he laid out the numbers 98% versus 73%, and made the case on its merits. He'd had that version of the conversation before, in other contexts, with other people who outranked him. Sometimes it worked. He looked at Sandra Mercer's face and understood that this was not one of those times. The whole shop was watching now. Not performing watching, actual watching. The kind where people stop pretending to work. Harold had turned fully around, coffee cup held with both hands like he was bracing for something. Sandra's voice carried clean across the concrete floor. Pack your tools. You're terminated, effective immediately. The sentence landed like something physical. Anthony didn't move for 2 seconds. 1, 2, controlled. Because the other option, the option where he reacted, the way his body wanted to react, the way 3 years of accumulated pressure and exhaustion and quiet rage wanted him to react, that option had consequences he couldn't afford. Zara's pulmonologist, 340. I still have the afternoon shift. His voice came out lower than he intended, barely above the idle hum of the shop. I need the hours. My daughter's medication. Sandra had already turned. She was walking toward the office stairs, clipboard under her arm. Not a pause, not a glance back. The decision had been made and she had moved past it, and that was that. And the 30-foot walk from his workstation to the staircase door was the most complete erasure of another human being Anthony had witnessed outside of a formal debrief. He stood there. The shop stayed quiet for another 3 seconds. Then someone went back to whatever they'd been doing. And that small sound, the resumption of normal, was somehow worse than the silence. Harold didn't move, didn't look away. Just watched Anthony the way an older man watches something he can't stop and can't fix, the particular grief of a witness. Anthony bent down, picked up his gauge, set it back in the olive drab box, latched it, carried it to his workstation and set it down next to the toolbox he'd had since before any of these people knew his name. He thought about taking the box with him. Decided to leave it. He'd come back for it, or he wouldn't. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting out of this building, before the feeling in his chest became something visible on his face. He had a very specific talent for not letting things show. He'd earned that talent the hard way. He took his jacket from the hook inside his personal locker. Didn't take the photo taped inside the locker door, because he never took it anywhere. It was there for the same reason people keep things they can't look at and can't throw away, because throwing it away would mean something he wasn't ready for it to mean. The photo was face down against the metal. Had been for 3 years. He closed the locker, walked out. Nobody said anything. Except Harold quietly, to nobody in particular, as Anthony passed. That man knows things the rest of us don't. Someone laughed, short, dismissive. The kind of laugh that requires not thinking too hard about what you're dismissing. Harold didn't respond, just stared at the olive drab toolbox sitting on the empty workstation, at the barely visible stamp on the corner, at the 3 letters scratched by hand into the metal that nobody else had bothered to read. A6. The walk from Mercer Automotive to the pharmacy on Glenwood was 9 blocks, and Anthony made it in 12 minutes because the October cool moved him faster than intention did. He stopped once at a corner. Not because of traffic. Because Zara had texted, she texted now. She had a phone, because Anthony had bought her one, so she could reach him from school if her breathing got bad, and her text said, "Dad, are you bringing my refill tonight?" and underneath that, because she couldn't help herself, "Also, can we have mac and cheese?" He stood on that corner and looked at that text for longer than he needed to. Yes to both, he sent back. He didn't know yet if that was true. He'd figure out how to make it true. He kept walking. The pharmacy on Glenwood was wedged between a barbershop and a hair supply store. Would you treat them with kindness? The kind of neighborhood institution that had been there long enough that nobody noticed it anymore, except the people who needed it, which was a different category of people than those who didn't. Anthony had learned that division the hard way. Before Zara's diagnosis, he'd gone years without setting foot in a pharmacy. After, he could tell you the difference between the brand name and the generic by texture alone, because the generic didn't work the same way. And one bad substitution had cost them an emergency room visit at 2 a.m. On a Tuesday, 800 he didn't have. Zara in a mask and a hospital gown, with her eyes asking him a question he didn't know how to answer. He stopped looking scared after that. Around her, at least. Pamela Scott had been the pharmacist at Glenwood RX for 9 years, and she knew Anthony by name and by the particular weight in his shoulders when the copay was going to be a conversation. She was 45, with a photograph of her daughter on the counter facing outward, not inward. Anthony had always thought that meant she wanted the customers to see it. Like she was saying, "This is why I show up. What's yours?" Tonight she looked at him, and then at the register, and her face did the thing it did when the number wasn't good. "Mr. Wilson. Zara's refill, you're still carrying a balance from last month, so with today's copay the total comes to, how much? $85.40. He opened his wallet. He'd been paid this morning. Technically, he'd been paid this morning. Direct deposit, before Sandra Mercer had voided the rest of his shifts. He did the calculation in his head, before his hand even reached the bills. He knew what was in there. He always knew what was in there. $38. Some coins. He set the bills on the counter, counted them out flat because crumpled bills took longer to count and time was a kind of dignity. 3 tens. 1 5. 3 ones. He went through the coins. 3 quarters. 4 dimes. 6 pennies. $38.46. Not enough. Pamela was looking at a point slightly above his head, giving him the privacy of not watching while he counted. He'd noticed she did this. He'd never mentioned it. "I can do a partial today," she said. "Give you enough for the rescue inhaler and hold the maintenance until she needs the maintenance medication." He kept his voice flat, not cold. Just flat, because cold was a choice and flat was a necessity. The rescue inhaler alone isn't sufficient management for her severity level. You know that. Pamela did know that. "I know. I know." He put the bills back in his wallet. Not because the transaction was over, but because he needed a moment where his hands were doing something other than falling short. "I'm going to figure it out." He was not immediately sure how he was going to figure it out. Behind him, someone in line shifted. He'd been aware of the line-building evening. People with prescriptions, an older woman with a grocery bag. He'd been aware of them the way he was always aware of his spatial context, peripherally, continuously, a habit he'd tried to turn off for 3 years and simply couldn't. And then a voice. Not loud, not performing, just clear and measured, and carrying the particular cadence of someone who gives orders professionally and has learned to make them sound like statements. Cover the difference, whatever the balance is. He turned. She was standing 2 people back in the line. The uniform was right, navy, commander's insignia on the collar, gold against dark fabric. She was close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of posture that happens when you've worn a uniform long enough that the spine forgets how to negotiate. She was looking directly at him. Not past him. At him. With an expression that was not pity, which was the thing Anthony was braced for, but something closer to recognition. Lorraine Mitchell stepped forward, placed a card on the counter. Pamela looked at the card, looked at Lorraine, looked at Anthony, and then, with the particular professional grace of someone who had learned not to ask questions, processed the transaction. The silence had a shape to it. Anthony said carefully, "I don't know you." Lorraine said, "No, but I know you." And then Commander Lorraine Mitchell. Naval Air Station Jacksonville, detached to Atlanta for the past 72 hours. A pause. Precise. "We've been looking for you, sir." Took longer than it should have. He felt the word "sir" land the way it always had. Like a door opening in a wall he'd spent 3 years building. "My name is Anthony Wilson. I'm a mechanic. I know what your name is. I also know what it was before." She didn't say it like a threat. She said it like a fact she was being careful with, the way you're careful with something that can cut if you hold it wrong. "You don't have to talk to me here, but I need you to know that we're here, and that what we need is significant, and that the Admiral sent me personally." Anthony looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Admiral Bryant." The name came out before he decided to say it. Muscle memory, or something adjacent to muscle memory. The part of him that Victor Bryant had trained was the part that apparently still answered to the man's name, even now. Lorraine didn't blink. He said you'd know. The pharmacy was very quiet for a place with 5 people and a floor fan running. Pamela was pretending to organize something behind the counter. Anthony took the bag with Zara's medication. He turned it once in his hands. Thought about the text waiting on his phone. Also, can we have mac and cheese? He thought about the 9 blocks back. He thought about the olive drab box sitting on the workstation in a shop that no longer employed him, and the photo inside the locker he hadn't looked at in 3 years, and the 3 letters scratched into metal that nobody at Mercer Automotive had ever bothered to understand. Not here, he said. No, Lorraine agreed. Not here. There's a federal building on Spring Street. 40 minutes. I have to take my daughter her medication first. Lorraine nodded once. Immediate. Of course. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on it. Didn't turn around fully. How did you find me? A beat. Then, from behind him, we found the toolbox first. NATO stock code Series 4, very specific. Then the call sign. He pushed the door open. The cool hit him, and he walked into it, and the door swung shut behind him, and he stood odd on the stalk for a moment with the pharmacy bag in his hand and the night coming down over Glenwood Avenue and something moving through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear. Not quite. The feeling of being located after believing yourself invisible. He walked home. He did not run, because running changes your breathing pattern, and he didn't want Zara to clock his breathing. She noticed things. Had always noticed things. Even before she had language for it, this quality of attention that she'd either inherited or developed as a means of monitoring his moods, and he wasn't sure which was more likely or which was worse. Would you treat them with kindness? Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been nice once, and was maintained now in the way that suggested the landlord had agreed to maintenance, without agreeing to improvement. Would you treat them with kindness? The elevator worked 3 days out of 5. Anthony always took the stairs, because the elevator was one of those things he couldn't count on, and he'd learned not to root himself through things he couldn't count on. He knocked twice their signal, so she didn't get startled, and then used his key. Zara was at the kitchen table, with her homework open, and her inhaler set to the left of her worksheet in the specific place she always set it, 3 inches from the edge, parallel to the page. She'd developed this habit herself, at 6, after one bad episode where the inhaler had been in her backpack instead of within reach. She never explained it. She just did it. Every time. And every time Anthony saw it, that inhaler, that precise 3 inches something compressed in his chest that he didn't have a name for. She was building systems around her own fragility before she was old enough to name what she was doing. Dad, she looked up. She was wearing the purple sweatshirt she'd gotten for her birthday. You look weird. I look the same I always look. No. You look like when you're trying to look normal but you're not. He set the pharmacy bag on the counter, took out her medications, the maintenance inhaler, the rescue, the new spacer the pulmonologist wanted her using, and lined them up. She watched him do this the way she always watched him do things she considered important. Full attention. The kind of attention most adults couldn't sustain. How was school? Fine. We did fractions. Mrs. Thompson said I was good at them. She paused. Are you good at fractions? I'm good at math. That's different. Not really. Fractions are a specific kind of math. Being good at math doesn't automatically mean. She stopped herself, picked up the rescue inhaler, and examined it with the professional air of someone conducting quality control. This is the new one. Same medication. Different lot number. Okay. She set it back down, 3 inches from the edge. Can we have mac and cheese? Already making it. He was not already making it. He went to make it. He stood at the stove with kindness. He stood at the stove and ran water and listened to her moving around at the table and thought about Lorraine Mitchell's face when she said we've been looking for you and the very particular weight that statement carried. If you understood what looking meant, what resources looking implied, what decision had to be made by someone with enough rank to authorize an active search. Victor Bryant had enough rank. Victor Bryant had always had enough rank. Would you treat them with kindness? Anthony put the pasta in the water and set the timer and stared at the bubbles beginning to form at the bottom of the pot and thought about a specific night, 11 years ago, with rotor wash and rain, and a radar display that was telling him one thing and his gut telling him something else. He'd trusted his gut. Twice. The second time had cost him. He turned the heat down. After dinner, after Zara had negotiated herself into 30 more minutes of reading before lights out, and he'd negotiated her down to 20, and they'd settled on 25. As they always did, he texted the neighbor Mrs. Collins in 3B, who had a key, and who Zara liked, and who had agreed years ago to be available for the occasional evening Anthony needed to step out. Mrs. Collins said yes. She said yes with kindness. She said yes whenever he asked because she was that kind of neighbor, the irreplaceable kind. And he made a note, another internal entry in the ledger he kept of debts that couldn't be paid in money to buy her whatever plant she was trying to grow on her balcony, the one that kept dying. He sat on the edge of Zara's bed. She was already reading. Her lips moved faintly when she read. She denied this. He'd never told her, he noticed. Dad? Yeah, is something happening? He looked at her. She was looking at her book but not reading. The page hadn't turned. Why? Because Mrs. Collins is coming, and you're wearing your good jacket, and you have that face. What face? The one you have when something is important, but you don't want to say it's important. He thought for a moment about the right response. Not the deflecting response, not the reassuring lie response. She was perceptive in the specific way that children become perceptive when they've had to pay close attention to the adults who are responsible for their survival, and she deserved better than reflexive minimization. Something came up with work. I need to go take care of it. The new work or the old work? The question stopped him cold. She was still looking at her book, still not reading. What do you mean? He said. I mean you have two kinds of work. The kind you do now, and the kind you used to do. She finally looked up. Her eyes were very direct. They'd always been direct, the kind of eye contact that adults found startling from a child. You never talk about the kind you used to do. But sometimes you get phone calls, and then you're quiet for a long time after. So I figured there were two kinds. He sat with that for a moment. The old work, he said. And because she'd earned the truth, I'll be back before you wake up. She nodded, went back to her book. And this time the page turned, which was her version of saying, okay, I trust you. And that was somehow the most complicated thing anyone had said to him all day. The federal building on Spring Street was the kind that didn't advertise itself. No large signage. No flag out front. The kind of nondescript presence that was itself a kind of announcement. If you knew what to look for, Anthony knew what to look for. Lorraine met him in the lobby, handed him a visitor badge. Walked him to a room on the 4th floor that was smaller than he expected, and more informal, 2 chairs at an angle, a table with a coffee maker that was clearly from a civilian supply chain, a single window with the blinds at half-mast. No flags, no seals, no visual performance of authority. Victor Bryant stood when he entered. Bryant was 62, and had been 62 in the way that some men are carrying rank so completely that it had become structural rather than performed. 3 rows of medals. But Anthony wasn't looking at the medals. He was looking at Bryant's face, which was the face of a man who had authorized this operation and was now accountable for whatever happened in this room, and who understood that accountability in the specific way that people do when they've made decisions that other people paid. Bryant extended his hand. Anthony looked at it for half a second. This was not disrespect. It was processing, and then took it. Anthony. Not lieutenant commander. Not rank. First name. Intentional. Sir. Sit down. There's coffee if you want it. He didn't want it. He sat. Bryant sat across from him. Not at the head of the table. Not at a power angle. Directly across. Close. The way you sit when you're not trying to manage someone, when you're trying to talk to them. Anthony filed that. I know you don't want to be here. Then let's be accurate about what you know, Anthony said. Not aggressive. Just precise. You know I left. You know what I've been doing. You don't know what I want. Bryant absorbed this without reaction, which was itself a reaction, a managed one. Fair. Let me ask, then, what do you want? To go home. Go to work. Pay for my daughter's medication. You got fired today. Not a question. Anthony studied him. How long have you been in Atlanta? 76 hours. So you've been watching me, we've been in proximity. Bryant leaned forward, elbows on his knees, which was a posture Anthony associated with the man's most serious conversations, the ones before major operations, the ones where Bryant would drop the command posture and just talk. I need you to understand that what I'm about to ask is significant. And I'm not going to pretend it isn't. He reached to the side table, picked up a photograph, set it on the low table between them. Brian Thompson, 34. The photo was formal flight suit, straight on, the particular controlled expression of someone trying to look professional for a record they'll carry for decades. Good face. Confident. Young in the specific way that people are young when they haven't yet been required to find out what they're made of. Lieutenant Brian Thompson, Bryant said. He's been missing for 53 hours. Naval Air Station Key West training exercise that went wrong fast. His helicopter went down 31 nautical miles off the Florida coast. Storm system moved in hard. Conditions deteriorated faster than the models called. We've had search teams running continuously. And they haven't found him. They've found nothing. Bryant pulled out a tablet. Radar data, satellite imaging, weather overlays, the kind of multi-source display that Anthony had learned to read not in a classroom, but in real conditions where the reading had to be fast, and the reading had to be right. We've run 17 passes. Standard maritime search protocol. 17 passes and nothing. But, he stopped, set the tablet in front of Anthony. I want you to look at this. Don't say anything. Just look. Anthony didn't want to look, he was already looking, because the moment the display came into his field of view, his mind had started doing the thing it did: the inventory, the pattern recognition, the spatial processing that 11 years of flight operations had built into him at a level that wasn't cognitive anymore. It was reflexive. It was the way his nervous system had been rewired by experience to speak fluently in the language of radar and water and weather and the behavior of machinery under stress. He saw it in approximately 4 seconds. The anomaly in the third quadrant. Low altitude return. Frequency signature inconsistent with static debris. The angle of the reflection relative to the surface depth. The way the signal was intermittent, not random. Intermittent in a pattern that matched the oscillation of a submerged structure moving with tidal shift. That's not debris, Anthony said. Bryant was very still. That's a fuselage. Titanium aluminum alloy. It's creating a reflection differential against the substrate because the seabed in that quadrant is high silica limestone. He pointed to the edge of the third sector. The signal is attenuated because the standard maritime frequency you're using doesn't penetrate effectively at this angle through that substrate composition. You need L-band 23-degree sweep. He pulled the tablet slightly toward himself, looked at the tidal data overlaid. He's alive. He's hiding the aircraft. The intermittent pattern is him adjusting his position to maintain an air pocket as the tide moves. He checked the timestamp against the tidal chart, maybe 9 hours before the cockpit floods completely. The room was very quiet. Lorraine was standing near the door. She hadn't moved in 2 minutes. Bryant said, "You saw that in 4 seconds." Anthony put the tablet back. "I flew that coastline 17 times. I know the substrate composition from Key West to Marathon from sea-level operational observation. No satellite can give you what a cockpit gives you." He paused. "Your intelligence team doesn't have that." "I do," Bryant said, and his voice was quiet and careful. "That's why I'm here." Anthony stood up, walked to the window. The blinds were at half-mast, and through the slats of Atlanta was doing what Atlanta did at 9 in the evening, glowing, moving, existing with the comfortable certainty of a city that didn't know there was a man hiding in a flooded cockpit 31 miles off the Florida Keys, adjusting his position by degrees as the water rose. "I left," Anthony said. "I know. I left for a reason. I know that too." "Then you know asking me back into this. I'm not asking you back." Bryant's voice was steady. He remained seated, which Anthony respected. No attempt to physically close the distance, no pressure play. I'm asking you to spend the next 8 hours in that room, down the hall, with Lorraine and my intelligence team, and tell them what you can see that they can't. That's all. Thompson goes home. You go home. End of conversation. Anthony turned from the window. He thought about Brian Thompson's face in that photograph. 34. The way he was trying to look older than he felt. Would you treat them with kindness? The controlled expression over what was probably something closer to nerves, because they were always nerves. Everyone was always nerves. The ones who said they weren't were either lying, or they'd burned out the warning system entirely. He thought about a 6-year-old girl who was waiting. He didn't know her name, but he knew she existed because Thompson's file would have been complete, and Bryant would have read it completely before coming to this room. He thought about Zara's text. Also, can we have mac and cheese? He thought about 3 people he had not been able to bring home. He said 9 hours. And because he was who he was, even now, even in jeans and a jacket that smelled like motor oil, he added, with the flatness of someone stating operational parameters, I need a whiteboard, and better coffee than whatever that is. Lorraine almost smiled. Almost. Bryant said, done. The shift happened at the other end of the city while Anthony was being led to a room with a whiteboard. Sandra Mercer sat alone in her office, on the 2nd floor of Mercer Automotive, in the dark, with the security monitor showing the shop floor below. The shop was empty, it was past closing. The workstations were clean and staged for tomorrow. Except one. Anthony Wilson's workstation, which was not quite clean and not quite staged, because Harold Reed had apparently decided the olive-drab toolbox should remain where it was, rather than be moved to the general storage area where unclaimed personal property usually ended up. She'd noticed Harold do this. She'd watched it on the monitor feed from her desk and decided not to comment. She was 45 minutes into doing something she did not often do, second-guessing herself. The decision had been correct. Procedurally, an employee using an unauthorized technique was a liability issue, a consistency issue, a training issue. The manual existed because standards existed, and standards existed because chaos was the alternative. Her father had built Mercer Automotive on consistency, on the idea that any one of his 14 locations could be expected to perform identically, that the brand was the standard, and the standard was the brand. She had inherited that principle. She had committed to it. The decision had been correct. She opened the security feed from Bay 3, found the earlier timestamp, watched Anthony Wilson work. She'd been watching for 6 minutes. When she admitted to herself that she watching for the same reason someone goes back to look at something they should have looked at more carefully the first time. His hands. That was what she kept coming back to. Not the techniques specifically, she'd looked up the technique already, had it pulled up in another tab, but the quality of his hands on the equipment. There was a difference between competent and certain, between trained and experienced, and the difference lived in exactly this, whether the hands hesitated. His didn't. Not once. Not a single micro-pause between one step and the next. Not the small adjustment that comes when someone is working from memory rather than from the body itself. She pulled up the technique in the other tab. Read it. Naval Air Systems Command. Field Modification, 2009. Developed for aircraft hydraulic system verification under combat forward conditions, where standard shop protocols were inapplicable. Accuracy rate, 98.3%. Standard OEM service manual protocol, 73.1%. She read it again. Sat back. The number wasn't the thing. The number was just a number. Would you treat them with kindness? What moved through her in the dark office, something uncomfortable, something she recognized and immediately tried to reframe, was the understanding that she had made a public, permanent decision to terminate an employee for doing something better than her standard required. And she had done it without asking why, without taking the 20 seconds, as it would have required to say, explain this to me. She hadn't asked because asking would have meant not knowing, and not knowing in front of an employee was something she decided 2 years ago she couldn't afford. The board watched everything she did. Her father's old managers watched everything she did. Every moment of uncertainty she displayed was catalogued and circulated, and used to answer the question they'd been asking since the day she stepped into this office: is she actually capable? She had made a decision that felt like certainty, because certainty was protective. She closed both tabs, stood up, walked to the window that looked out over the dark shop floor at the toolboxes and the lifts and the olive drab box sitting on an empty workstation. She went home, but the math stayed with her. 98.3 against 73.1. The hands that didn't hesitate. The voice that said, "I need money for my daughter's medication." And the way she had kept walking. The 30-foot walk that she was now replaying, with the specific attention she should have paid it the first time, examining what she had chosen not to examine. She did not sleep well. She had not slept badly in 2 years because she did not allow it. Insomnia was a luxury of people who let uncertainty follow them into their beds, and she had been disciplined about leaving uncertainty at the office door. Tonight the discipline failed. She lay in the dark, and the monitor feed ran behind her eyes, and the hands that didn't hesitate kept moving, kept working, kept doing the thing correctly that she hadn't bothered to understand. 98.3. 73.1. She had fired him for the difference. By midnight, back at the Federal Building on Spring Street, Anthony was at the whiteboard with a dry erase marker, and 2 of Bryant's analysts were at their laptops running the frequency adjustments he'd specified, and Lorraine was on the phone with the Rescue Coordination Center at Key West. The tidal data was updating every 30 minutes. The window was narrowing. Anthony drew the approach vector on the whiteboard, marked the substrate zones, annotated the L-band sweep parameters with the degree precision that had taken him 2 years of actual flying to understand at operational depth. The analysts worked in his wake, translating his annotations into actionable coordinates. He didn't think about Mercer Automotive. He didn't think about the 30-foot walk. He thought about the third quadrant, about a titanium aluminum fuselage in 40 feet of water, adjusted against a limestone shelf, holding a pocket of air against the inexorable arithmetic of tidal pressure. He thought about the margin, the 9 hours that were now down to 8, and the approach vector that had to be right, because there was no second approach, not with the bottom conditions being what they were. He drew the line. His hand didn't hesitate. In the fluorescent light of the Federal Building, with Atlanta going quiet outside, and Zara asleep 9 blocks north, and Lorraine's voice running in the background with calm, precise communications, would you treat them with kindness? Anthony Wilson stood at a whiteboard and remembered with his entire body what it felt like to be the person in the room who could see what other people couldn't. He had not wanted to remember. But some things don't wait for want. The analysts were good. Would you treat them with kindness? That was the first thing he noticed. They were genuinely good and methodical, and they weren't performing competence the way junior personnel sometimes did around someone with his history. They were just working, running the adjustments, cross-referencing the substrate data he'd marked, building the new sweep model with the focused economy of people who understood what the clock was doing. He appreciated that. He'd always worked better alongside people who understood the clock. The second thing he noticed, Lorraine Mitchell ran communications the way he used to run pre-flight checks. Systematic. No wasted breath. Every exchange with Key West was a data point, integrated immediately into the evolving picture. She didn't perform authority, she just used it, cleanly, the way tools are meant to be used. He found himself calibrating to her rhythm without deciding to. At 11:48 p.m., the new sweep data came back from the Key West coordination team. They had reoriented the search asset to the revised coordinates. L-band 23 degrees, approach from the northeast to avoid the substrate shadow he'd mapped. Anthony stood over the laptop and looked at the return data. There. Third quadrant. Solid return. Consistent depth. Fuselage signature unmistakable. Now against the adjusted frequency. There he is, one of the analysts said, and his voice had something in it that he probably didn't intend to be audible, the specific catch of relief when a possibility becomes a certainty. Anthony straightened up. He thought just for a second, involuntary. The way a breath is, involuntary about another night and another radar screen and 3 signals that had been there and then weren't. The way certainty can reverse itself. How the worst moments of his life had also begun with a solid return on a screen. He pushed it down. This wasn't that night. Thompson was there, living, adjusting his position in the cabin, conserving air, waiting with whatever reserve of training and stubbornness he had left. Brian Thompson was 34 and had a 6-year-old at home, and was currently proving that the Navy's training program was worth every dollar and every hour because he was still alive, and he was making himself findable by someone who knew what to look for. "Get the rescue diver team in position," Anthony said. He turned to Lorraine. "They need to come in from the northeast, 40-meter descent line. They should find the starboard door within 8 feet of the northeast corner of the fuselage. The door's likely warped from impact, but Thompson will have the emergency release he knows to stay with the aircraft until he hears the divers." Lorraine was already on the radio. Bryant had come into the room somewhere in the past hour. Anthony had registered him in his peripheral awareness, the way he registered everything noted, filed, returned to primary focus. Bryant stood at the back of the room now, and watched and didn't interfere, and Anthony recognized this, too, as the mark of the particular kind of commanding officer that was actually rare, one who understood that the most useful thing he could do right now was nothing. "Lorraine, into the radio, copy Key West. Confirm northeast approach 40-meter line starboard side. Team is cleared to descend on my mark." She looked at Anthony. He looked at the tidal data one more time. The window, the approach, the margin which was tighter than he liked but workable, definitely workable, if the team moved now. He nodded. She said mark. The room exhaled. Not all at once, gradually, by degree, the particular release of sustained tension when action finally begins, and the waiting is over. Anthony set the marker down on the whiteboard tray, looked at the diagram he'd drawn, the lines and zones and the annotated approach vector. He thought, "Come on, Thompson. Stay with it. Stay with the aircraft." He didn't say it out loud, but it was what he thought. Bryant came to stand beside him. Not close. 3 feet. The distance of respect rather than intimacy. He didn't say anything either. He looked at the whiteboard, the way people look at something they need to remember, the way you look when you're trying to commit a thing to permanent storage. After a moment, Bryant said quietly, "How long since you looked at radar data?" 3 years. Felt like it? Anthony considered that. The honest answer. No. It felt like 11 years ago. Bryant nodded slowly, like he'd expected that. Like he understood from experience that certain kinds of knowing don't atrophy the way other things do, that they go underground but not away, that the underground version is often cleaner than the active one because it's been stripped of everything except the essential. Anthony's phone buzzed. "Mrs. Collins, Zara is asleep, everything fine." She said, "Tell you good night." He stood in the federal building on Spring Street in Atlanta in the middle of the night, with radar data on the screen and an approach vector on the whiteboard and the taste of old coffee in his mouth, and he looked at that text from his neighbor. "Tell her good night back," he wrote. "I'll be home before she wakes up." And this was the thing about 2 kinds of work, the old kind and the new kind. The line between them wasn't as clean as he'd wanted it to be. It had never been as clean as he'd wanted it to be. It was messier than a line. It was more like 2 bodies of water that share an edge, where you can't step into one without disturbing the other, and the disturbance travels both ways. He was here because of what he used to be. He'd gotten fired this morning because of who he'd tried to become. And in approximately, he checked the tidal model 6 minutes. Brian Thompson was either going to be pulled out of a flooded cockpit by Navy rescue divers, or he wasn't, and that outcome was no longer in Anthony's hands. He'd given it everything he had. Whatever happened in the next 6 minutes, that part was done. Bryant, beside him, said nothing, just stood there, quiet, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement, the acknowledgement of a man who understands what it costs to walk back into a room you decided to walk out of, and who isn't going to make you explain it. Anthony was grateful for that. He was not going to say so, but he was grateful. The radio on Lorraine's station crackled. She picked it up, listened for 4 seconds. Anthony watched her face. She turned around. and her face said everything before her voice did the release of something that had been held at high tension, the specific change in the set of the jaw, and the softening around the eyes that happens when the number comes back right. "They have him," she said. "He's out. Vital signs stable. He's out." The two analysts made sounds. Bryant closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds and then opened them and was composed again. Lorraine was already back on the radio, coordinating the medical team, the transport, the documentation. Anthony looked at the whiteboard, at the approach vector, at the line he'd drawn with a hand that didn't hesitate. He thought about Thompson's face in that photograph, the controlled expression. He thought about a 6-year-old girl who was going to see her father tomorrow. He thought about 3 people he had not brought home. And here was the terrible and true and complicated thing, the thing he had not wanted to go near for 3 years. The fact that Brian Thompson being alive did not undo what had happened, did not balance any ledger, did not mean the math was resolved or the debt was paid, or that the 3 empty spaces in the formation had been filled. But Thompson was alive, and only that was what he'd been asked to do tonight. He put the cap on the dry erase marker, set it back in the tray. "I'm going home," he said. "Bryant, of course." And then carefully, "Anthony." He stopped. "Thank you. Not for the outcome. Not for the technical work." The way Bryant said it, low, direct, with the particular weight of a man who has sent people into bad situations and carried the consequences, it meant something larger than that. Meant, "I know what it cost you to come through that door tonight. I'm not going to pretend it didn't cost anything." Anthony said, "Good night, Admiral," and walked out. The street outside with kindness, and he walked north was cool and quiet, and he walked north toward the apartment, and the night had that specific clarity that comes at 2 in the morning, when the traffic is gone, and the city sounds drop an octave and you can actually hear your own footsteps. 9 blocks. 12 minutes. He went over the grocery list in his head. They were out of pasta. Zara's school had a project, due Thursday, about weather systems. He'd helped her with the part about pressure differentials, which had been almost funny, had very nearly made him tell her why he knew so much about pressure differentials, had made him realize how many things he nearly told her every week and chose not to. He'd tell her someday, when she was older, when she had the context to hold it right. He climbed the stairs, opened the apartment door carefully. The lights were off. Mrs. Collins had left a note on the table. She woke up once asking about mac and cheese, told her you were taking care of it. She accepted this, which was the most Mrs. Collins thing possible, and he was going to buy her that plant, the big one, the one that actually needed east-facing light. He looked in on Zara. She was asleep on her side, the way she always slept, one hand near her face, the rescue inhaler on the nightstand 3 inches from the edge. The purple sweatshirt discarded on the floor because she always kicked it off in her sleep. He picked it up, set it on the chair. He went to the kitchen, made himself a bowl of cereal because it was 2 a.m. And there was nothing else he wanted to think about right now, except the crunch of cereal and the cold of the milk and the particular quiet of a city apartment at 2 in the morning. He thought about tomorrow, about the olive drab toolbox still sitting on the workstation at Mercer Automotive, about the 340 for Zara's pulmonologist follow-up, about the afternoon shift he'd lost and the math that now required recalculating. He thought about Lorraine Mitchell standing in that pharmacy line, calm and precise, and the word "sir" landing like a door in a wall. He thought about Sandra Mercer's 30-foot walk. He finished his cereal, washed the bowl, turned off the kitchen light. He did not go to the couch the way he had every night. For 3 years the couch he slept on because the bedroom was Zara's, and he had never wanted her to feel like her space was borrowed or conditional. He stood in the dark hallway for a moment with his hand on the wall. Then he went to the couch, set the alarm for 6:45 because Zara's bus came at 7:30 and she liked him to make breakfast, and the mac and cheese promise was still technically outstanding, and he was a man who settled his debts. But just before he closed his eyes, the thought arrived, quiet and unbidden. Thompson's daughter is going to see her father tomorrow. Just that one thing. He let himself have it. Let himself sit with it for the length of one breath, without analysis, without qualification, without the three names he always brought with him into every good moment to remind himself it wasn't earned. Just, she's going to see her father. Then he set the thought down and closed his eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, was asleep in under 2 minutes. He made Zara's breakfast at 6:52. Scrambled eggs. Toast. Would you treat them with kindness? The mac and cheese debt officially deferred to dinner by mutual agreement, which she accepted with the negotiating grace of someone who understood that a promise deferred was still a promise. Would you treat them with kindness? She ate with her homework open beside her plate, finishing a worksheet on weather systems while he stood at the sink, and he watched her pencil move across the page and thought about pressure differentials and said nothing. She looked up once, studied his face. You slept. I always sleep. Not like that. Your eyes look different today. She picked up her pencil. Good different. He handed her the orange juice. Eat your eggs. She ate her eggs. He turned back to the sink. Let her look at him if she wanted to. The bus came at 7:28. He watched it from the window until it turned the corner. Would you treat them with kindness? Then he stood in the kitchen for a moment with his coffee going cold in his hand and the apartment settling into its daytime quiet around him, and he thought about the day in front of him. No shift. No job. $41 and some change in his wallet because Lorraine had covered the pharmacy balance, and he'd paid Pamela the $38 he'd counted out, and the rest he'd kept because rent required keeping it. The math was what the math was. He needed to start making calls today. He knew 3 other shops in the area. He knew his reputation because his reputation was one of the few things that hadn't cost him money to build. He picked up his phone, looked at it, set it down. He picked it up again and opened the message thread with Lorraine from last night. The last message in the thread was hers, sent at 2:47 a.m. Thompson is at Naval Air Station Key West. Vital stable, fractured clavicle, moderate hypothermia, dehydration. His family has been notified. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson. Not Raven 6. Not Lieutenant Commander, Mr. Wilson. He appreciated that she'd understood the distinction. He got dressed, went to the grocery store on Memorial Drive, bought pasta and a box of the specific cereal Zara liked, and 2 cans of the soup she ate when her chest was tight and she didn't want a full meal. He stood in the produce aisle for 2 minutes trying to remember if they were out of apples. They were out of apples. He bought apples. He was in the checkout line when his phone rang. Unknown number. Atlanta area code. He almost didn't answer. Would you treat them with kindness? He almost never answered unknown numbers anymore, had trained himself out of it during the period when debt collectors had been enthusiastic about his contact information. But something, the old instinct, the one that treated an unknown as a data point, rather than a threat, made him pick up. Mr. Wilson. Not a question. Male voice. Controlled. The particular control of someone who manages his vocal register deliberately. This is Raymond Harris. I chair the board of directors at Mercer Automotive Group. Anthony moved out of the checkout line, stood near the bread aisle. Mr. Harris, I'm going to be direct with you. I saw the video this morning. What video? A pause. Short Harris recalibrated. You haven't seen it. I don't know what you're referring to. Mr. Wilson? Harris' voice shifted, not warmer, but more careful, like a man who had just realized the ground he was standing on was less solid than he'd mapped. Someone filmed last night, at the parking structure on Spring Street, a Navy vehicle. A female officer addressing you as a commanding officer, you analyzing what appears to be classified data. Another pause. The video has been viewed approximately 800,000 times as of 40 minutes ago, and the number is still climbing. Anthony stood next to a rack of sourdough loaves and processed this. 800,000. The comment section, Harris continued, and now his voice had an edge that was not directed at Anthony, but was present regardless. The edge of a man facing a consequence he did not engineer and cannot immediately contain, is calling for a boycott of Mercer Automotive. The hashtag has been trending since approximately 6 a.m. Anthony said nothing. I need to understand, Harris said. Who are you? It was not a rude question. It was a genuinely disoriented one, and Anthony respected the honesty of it enough to give him a real answer. I'm a mechanic, Anthony said. Or I was until yesterday morning. Harris was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm calling an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. I'd like you present if you're willing. I'm not. Mr. Wilson, my situation with Mercer Automotive is between me and Ms. Mercer. I'm not interested in a board meeting. He kept his voice level. Not hostile, just clear, in the way that boundaries are clearest when they're delivered without heat. If you have something specific to say to me, say it now. Harris said it now. Are you Lieutenant Commander Anthony Wilson? Call sign Raven 6, recipient of the Navy Cross for actions during Operation Black Tide. The bread aisle was very quiet. My name is Anthony Wilson, he said. I'm going back to my groceries. He hung up. He stood there for 3 seconds with his phone in his hand and sourdough loaves behind him, and the checkout line moving 12 feet away with a normalcy that suddenly seemed very loud. 800,000. He went back to the checkout line, paid for his groceries, carried them home. He'd put everything away and was standing at the kitchen counter with his second cup of coffee when he looked up the video. He hadn't wanted to look it up. Would you treat them with kindness? But not looking was a choice with consequences too, and he'd learned to pick his consequences deliberately rather than by avoidance. It had been filmed from the second level of the Spring Street parking structure, looking down at the entrances to the federal building. The angle was oblique but clear enough. He could see himself, in the jacket, talking to Lorraine. He could see the Navy vehicle in the background. He could see the moment Lorraine handed him the tablet, and the moment 4 seconds exactly, just as it had happened before he pointed to the screen. The audio had caught Lorraine's voice. 52 hours. And you saw that in 4 seconds. His response was less audible, but the closed caption overlay that someone had added read, I flew that coastline 17 times. Then helicopter footage that someone else had apparently filmed from the street, showing the aircraft on the ground and the Navy personnel, cut together. Titled CEO fired Navy veteran for being too good at his job, and then this happened. Would you treat them with kindness? He put his phone face down on the counter. He thought about the 4.1 million people who had watched a 43-second video and arrived at a conclusion about who he was. Some of them were right. Some of them had the facts correctly sequenced. But the facts treat them with kindness. But correctly sequenced weren't the same thing as understanding. And a million people understanding the surface of something was not the same as one person understanding the depth of it. He turned his phone back over. Texted Harold Reed's kindness. Reed's number. Harold had given it to him 8 months ago when they'd had to coordinate a parts delivery, and Harold had written it on a piece of paper and folded it once and said, keep it in the tone of a man who was offering something more general than a phone number. Don't move the toolbox, Anthony texted. I'll get it when I can. Harold responded in 40 seconds, already told them to keep their hands off it. How you doing? Not a question from Harold. A statement checking for permission to be a question. Managing, Anthony wrote. Good man, Harold wrote back. And then nothing else, because Harold Reed was a man who understood that sometimes the appropriate follow-up to a sufficient answer was silence. The board meeting at Mercer Automotive happened at 2 o'clock without Anthony, as he'd requested. He knew this because Lorraine texted him at 2:43 to inform him that Admiral Bryant had been asked to attend and had agreed. He appreciated her judgment. He'd appreciated it since the bread aisle. He was in the middle of his third call to a potential employer, a shop in Decatur that ran a smaller operation than Mercer, but had a reputation for treating their senior mechanics like senior mechanics rather than line workers when his doorbell rang. Mrs. Collins's specific knock, which was not a ring at all but 3 knocks with the second one slightly harder. He ended the call, opened the door. There's a woman downstairs, Mrs. Collins said. She was 64 and had lived in 3B for 11 years and had opinions about most things that she shared selectively and about people that she shared rarely, standing outside. She doesn't look like she's from around here. A pause. Not in a bad way. In a she knows she belong here and is standing there anyway way. Anthony looked past her toward the stairwell. What does she look like? Expensive. Nervous. Trying very hard not to look nervous. He thought about that description for a moment. Tell her I'll be down in 5 minutes. He changed his shirt. Would you treat them with kindness? Not because he cared what Sandra Mercer thought of his shirt, but because 3 years of single parenthood had taught him that there was a version of composure that lived in small acts of deliberateness. And he needed composure right now more than he needed to make a point. She was standing on the sidewalk in front of the building. Not the sidewalk, a deliberate distance from the door. The body language of someone who has decided to wait in the less comfortable position because the more comfortable one would feel like presuming she had driven herself. He could see the car, a sensible sedan, not the kind of vehicle he'd have expected parked at the curb with the hazards on, which told him she hadn't planned to stay long but wasn't sure how long she'd be. She'd removed her jacket, was holding it, which meant she'd started wearing it and then taken it off, which meant the wearing of it had felt like armor, and she'd decided consciously to not wear armor to this conversation. Would you treat them with kindness? He noticed all of this in the 3 seconds it took him to walk from the building entrance to where she was standing. Sandra Mercer looked like she had not slept. Would you treat them with kindness? She was still very composed, the structural composure of someone who'd been maintaining it through effort rather than ease. Her eyes were direct when they found his, which he appreciated, because looking away would have read as performing guilt. And this felt like something different, like actual guilt. The kind that doesn't perform because it doesn't need to. She said, "I should have called first." He said, "You didn't have my number." A beat. I got it from Harold Reed. He gave it without asking me why I wanted it, which I thought was either very trusting or very strategic. Harold is usually strategic. She held the jacket in front of her with both hands, looked at him steadily. "I came to apologize. I want to do it in person, because a phone call would have been easier. And I don't think I've earned easier." He looked at her for a moment. The street behind her was doing its afternoon thing, a delivery driver double parked, a kid on a bike taking the sidewalk too fast and correcting at the last second. Normal, all of it normal, and here they were on the sidewalk being something else entirely. "Come up," he said. She followed him up the stairs without comment. He held the stairwell door. She went through. He noted that she looked at the building, the way someone looks at a place they're trying to understand, rather than evaluate, not assessing whether it was nice, but reading what it meant. He unlocked the apartment. She stepped inside. He watched her take in the kitchen, the medical bills on the table, which he hadn't put away, and now was not going to retroactively hide, because they were what they were, the medications lined on the counter, the photograph on the refrigerator. The apartment was clean. Small, organized in the specific way that people organize small spaces, when they can't afford to let disorder accumulate. She was looking at the medications, then at the bills, then at the photograph. She turned back to him. Her face had changed, not dramatically, not with the theatrical shift that happens in performances of emotion, just quietly, in the way that understanding changes a face when it arrives through the eyes rather than through the ears. Something had landed. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make coffee." She sat at the kitchen table. He made coffee. Neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected it to be uncomfortable. "I fired you," she said, when he set the cup in front of her, "because you were doing something I didn't recognize, and I was in a room full of people watching to see how I'd handle it, and I made a fast decision because fast was what felt like authority." She stopped, picked up the cup, set it down. "That's not an explanation. That's a confession." He sat across from her. "There's a difference. An explanation has a justification built into it. What I did had no justification. The decision was wrong the moment I made it." She met his eyes. "I looked up the technique that night. 98.3% accuracy. I've been running 73.1% for 2 years and telling myself it was a standard." A pause. "You were making us better and I terminated you for it." He drank his coffee. "Let the statement occupy the room. The video," he said, "has been seen by approximately 1.4 million people as of an hour ago, and the number is still moving." Raymond Harris called an emergency board meeting. Admiral Bryant attended. She said this flatly, without the performance of being overwhelmed by it, which made him believe her more than if she'd seemed distressed. "The board wants to know what I'm going to do." Several of them want to know what I'm going to do about my position. What are you going to do? She looked at him. Direct. That depends partly on what you want. He sat back, studied her. He had spent 11 years reading people under pressure, not in the armchair sense, not with the casual confidence of someone who'd read the right books, but operationally, consequentially, in environments where a misread could end badly for everyone in the room. He was reading Sandra Mercer right now, and what he was reading was not strategy, not PR crisis management, not the careful positioning of a person protecting a position. Would you treat them with kindness? She was sitting in his kitchen at 3 in the afternoon, with her jacket in her lap, and her coffee going cold, and she was doing the thing that was hardest for people who had built themselves around control. Would you treat them with kindness? She was sitting with the outcome of her own mistake without trying to redirect it towards something more comfortable. He said, "What I want is to pay for my daughter's medication without counting coins." She nodded. 1. Precise. And I want to be hired because I'm good at the work, not because a video made it embarrassing not to hire me. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, she said. No, but the order matters. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that he did not expect. My father built this company by finding people who were better than the manual. He had a saying, he used it enough that I could recite it at 15 and thought it was annoying, and understand it at 31, and know it was the most important thing he ever said to me. She stopped. He said the manual is what we know how to write down. Excellence is everything we haven't figured out how to teach yet. Anthony said nothing. I forgot that, she said. I built the last 2 years on the manual because the manual was defensible. And I fired you because you were excellence I didn't know how to defend. She finally picked up the coffee. Drank. I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson. I'm sorry for what I said in that shop. I'm sorry for walking away. I'm sorry for not asking. The apartment was quiet. From downstairs, muffled, someone's television. Mrs. Collins's afternoon program, which ran at 3, and which Anthony had heard through the floor for 3 years. He thought about Lorraine's text from this morning. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. He thought about Harold's good man. He thought about Thompson in a decompression chamber in Key West, his fractured clavicle being managed, his 6-year-old being driven to meet him. The technique I was using, he said. Your senior technicians should know it. All of them. It takes about 4 hours to teach properly. Sandra Mercer looked at him. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief. Something more like the recognition of a person who has offered you more than you asked for, and you understand, suddenly, the size of what you were asking. I'd like to hear about it, she said. You'd need to change the manual. I know. And the approval process for non-standard techniques. Right now, your shop has no mechanism for evaluating a new method before rejecting it. It goes straight from unfamiliar to terminated. He held her gaze. That's not a manual problem. That's a culture problem. She didn't flinch. I know that too. He put his cup down. I'll think about it. She nodded, stood up, picked up her jacket. That's fair. She moved toward the door, stopped, turned back, because there was something she hadn't said, and she was apparently a person who, once she'd decided to be honest, was thorough about it. For what it's worth, Harold Reed stopped anyone from moving your toolbox this morning. He told them it stays until you come back for it. He didn't say if, he said until. Anthony looked at her. Harold Reed, he said, has been in that shop for 30 years. He knows things about how to treat people that most business schools have never thought to write down. She took that with her, went down the stairs. He heard the building door. Then, a moment later, the car. He stood in the kitchen. The bills on the table, the medications on the counter, the photograph on the refrigerator. He thought about Sandra Mercer's face when she said, I forgot that. The specific flatness of it, not self-pitying, not performing contrition, just accurate. A woman making an accurate accounting of a failure and handing it over without softening. He thought, that takes something. He didn't know yet what to do with the thought, but he filed it. His phone buzzed. Lorraine again. He read it standing at the counter. Admiral Bryant would like 10 minutes tomorrow morning. No operational ask. He wants to talk about something else. His words, something he should have said 3 years ago. Your call entirely. LM. He set the phone down, turned to the window. Would you treat them with kindness? The afternoon light was coming in at the angle it came in at this time of year low, cutting across the countertop at a slant, catching the edge of Zara's purple cup she'd left by the dish rack. Something he should have said 3 years ago. Anthony knew Victor Bryant well enough to understand that this was not maneuvering. Bryant was not a man who maneuvered toward people. He was a man who, when he owed a thing, paid it directly. And the fact that he was characterizing it as something he should have said, rather than something operational, meant it wasn't a recruitment pitch, wasn't another ask, wasn't the setup for a follow-on to last night. It was something else. He texted back, 7 a.m., same building. The next morning, Bryant was already there when Anthony arrived. Coffee that was marginally better than the night before. Bryant had apparently also noted the problem. They sat in the same 2 chairs at the same angle, and the whiteboard behind them had been erased, which felt intentional. Bryant said, I owe you an accounting. Anthony waited. After black tide, Bryant said, I wrote 3 commendation letters. 1 for the record, 2 personal to the families of Carver and Dominguez. He stopped, adjusted. I didn't write 1 to you. I told myself it was because you were alive and they weren't, and the living could wait. But that wasn't the reason. He looked at Anthony directly. The reason was that I didn't know what to say to a man who had gone back twice and come out alive when the people he went back for didn't. And I chose my discomfort over your need. That was wrong. Anthony sat with this. It was a very long time since anyone had put language around that specific thing. The asymmetry of it. The way surviving something that others didn't survive creates a particular silence around you. Not because people are cruel, but because they don't know how to approach the shape of it. Reeves, Anthony said, after a moment. Nobody wrote to Reeves's family. Bryant closed his eyes. Brief. Then opened them. I know. I corrected that 6 months later. Too late, I know that too. He was 26. Yes. The room held that number for a moment. Anthony said, You didn't cause what happened to them, no, but I had responsibilities after, and I failed them. Bryant was not asking for absolution. His voice was too steady for that, too factual. This was a man making a report on himself, accurately, because accurate reports were the obligation of people in positions like his. I should have found you when you left. I should have said this then. I'm saying it now because it's still owed. Anthony looked at the erased whiteboard. At the ghost of the approach vector he'd drawn, faint under the erasure, the ghost of a line his hand had made without hesitation. 3 people went home because of Reeves and Carver, and Dominguez, he said. He hadn't said this out loud before. Had thought it. Hadn't said it. They held the position so the others could get out. I've known that from the beginning. I've known it the way you know something you can't let yourself use because using it feels like reducing what they did to a useful number. Bryant was quiet. 14 people, Anthony said. Against 3. I'm not a man who does that math. But I know the math exists, and I know there are 14 people alive because of a decision they made that I didn't ask them to make. He stopped, looked at Bryant. I'm not going to be okay about it, but I'm starting to understand that not okay and not functional aren't the same thing. Bryant said quietly, That's the most honest thing I've heard anyone say about combat loss in 30 years. And Anthony, because the honesty was apparently contagious today, I almost didn't go back. The second time, I sat in the cockpit with the hydraulics failing and I almost turned around. I want you to know that. Because I've let people believe I didn't hesitate, and that's not accurate. And the inaccuracy has been sitting in me for 3 years like something I need to put down. You went back, Bryant said. I almost didn't. You went back, not arguing. Just repeating the fact because the fact was what it was regardless of the almost. The almost doesn't change what happened. What happened is what happened. Anthony took a breath. Let it out. I know. And here was the strange thing about that moment in the small room, with the erased whiteboard and the marginally better coffee. The almost didn't get smaller. It didn't go away. It sat in him the same way it had always sat in him, present and specific and real. But it sat differently. The way a stone sits differently when you've finally acknowledged its weight rather than carrying it while pretending it doesn't have any. He drove to Mercer Automotive afterward. Not because he'd made a decision. Because the toolbox was there, and Harold deserved a conversation, and the decision about the rest of it, Sandra's offer, the technique, the manual. All of it could be made after the toolbox was retrieved rather than before. The shop was in its mid-morning routine. 2 bays occupied. Harold was at his station doing what Harold always did with the focused lack of drama of someone who had been working for 30 years and had concluded that the work itself was the whole point. Harold saw Anthony come in, looked at him for a moment, said nothing, got up, walked to Anthony's old workstation, stood beside the olive-drab toolbox with his arms crossed. Kept it, Harold said. I see that. Darnell wanted to put it in storage, I heard. Harold looked at the toolbox. Then at Anthony. You done with the other thing? Anthony understood what he was asking. The thing Harold had seen in the NATO stock code and the scratched letters and the photo in the locker that was face down. The other thing. For now. Harold nodded, reached down, picked up the toolbox by the handle, and held it out. Anthony took it. It weighed what it always weighed, more than the metal, less than everything he'd carried it through. You coming back? Harold asked. I don't know yet. Fair. Harold went back to his station, sat down, picked up his wrench, and then, without looking up, the way Harold delivered things that mattered sideways, quiet, aimed at the wall rather than at the person. Shop runs worse without you. Not worse like slower. Worse like the guys don't learn anything. Anthony stood there a moment. They're learning, he said. Not enough. He carried the toolbox to his car, sat in the driver's seat. The box was on the passenger seat. He looked at it for a moment, at the NATO code, at the A6 scratched in the corner. He picked up his phone, called Sandra Mercer. She answered on the second ring. If we're doing this, he said, I want to talk to you about the approval process before I talk to the board. The board is a conversation about outcome. You and I need to have the conversation about structure first. A pause. Short. Then, when, this afternoon? Your office. 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock, he agreed and hung up. He sat in the car a moment longer. The street outside Mercer Automotive was doing its regular thing. A truck making a delivery 2 doors down. A woman power walking with headphones. A kid on a scooter moving fast enough to be reckless but not fast enough to be in actual danger. Normal. All of it normal. He started the car. Had to pick up Zara at 3:15. Had to buy the plant for Mrs. Collins, the big one, the one that kept dying on her balcony. He was going to look up what was killing it and fix that too. He thought about the accountability in Bryant's voice that morning. The weight of it. The way Bryant had said, I should have found you, as a statement of fact, rather than a performance of regret. He thought about Sandra in his kitchen, I forgot that. And the way she delivered it clean, no softening, no redirect. The manual is what we know how to write down. Her father's words, carried in her, the way children carry the things parents say before they understand them, and understand them only after the parents are gone to teach them anything else. He pulled out of the parking lot. He had 2 hours before 2 o'clock. He went to the garden center on Moreland Avenue. The woman at the garden center, her name badge said Angela. She knew plants with the specificity of genuine love rather than job requirement. Listened to his description of the balcony, the sun exposure, the drainage, the pattern of dying. Took him to 3 different sections. Showed him a bird of paradise, wrong light for that balcony, and then a cast iron plant, which she said with some enthusiasm was the most accurately named plant in existence because it could survive almost anything, and then finally a fiddle leaf fig in a good-sized pot. But, Angela said, the fiddle leaf is going to need consistent light and she can't let it dry out completely between waterings. Most people blame the plant when it drops leaves. The plant isn't wrong. The placement is wrong. Anthony looked at the fiddle leaf. What does it need? East-facing light. Water when the top inch of soil is dry. And to not be moved around constantly. They do much better when they're allowed to stay. He bought the fiddle leaf fig. He also bought a small card and wrote, from your neighbor, east-facing window if you have one. He brought it to Mrs. Collins before the meeting. She opened the door and looked at the plant and then at him and then at the note, and she said, east-facing. I've been putting it on the west side this whole time. She held the door open. Come in. I'll make you something before you go wherever you're going. I have a meeting. Then I'll make it fast. He went in. She made him a sandwich. He ate it standing at her kitchen counter. She didn't ask about the video. He appreciated that. She asked about Zara's last appointment, and he told her, and she said the pulmonologist they were using was the right one because her cousin had used that practice and they were thorough. He filed that as confirmation of a decision he'd already made. He left at 1:47, drove to Mercer Automotive, parked, sat for a moment. The shop through the front windows was visible from the lot. He could see Harold at his station, could see the space where his workstation had been, now with a parts cart moved into it, the kind of filling in that happens when organizations absorb a gap without acknowledging the gap itself. He went inside, up the stairs. Sandra Mercer's office had a window that looked down on the shop floor. She was standing at it when he knocked and entered. She turned. She was in a different suit, darker, more formal, and she looked like someone who had slept approximately as poorly as he'd expected. She said, "Thank you for coming." He sat down in the sitting area near the window, 2 chairs and a low table, which he read as deliberate. Same deliberateness as Bryant, sitting across from him rather than at the head of the table. People who understood power were careful about how they arranged furniture. The approval process, he said. Yes. Right now your shop has one mechanism for handling non-standard technique, supervisor review, which in practice means the supervisor either recognizes the technique or flags it as non-compliant. There's no middle step, no evaluation process, no way to say, "I don't recognize this, let's understand it before we decide." He looked at her. You need an evaluation protocol. 30 days to review any technique not in the manual. Technical merit assessment against the current standard. If the new method outperforms, the manual updates. Sandra was listening with the focused quality of someone taking real notes internally rather than just managing a conversation. Who runs the evaluation? Senior technicians, minimum 15 years experience. Not supervisors. Supervisors have incentives to protect the existing process. Senior techs have incentives to find what works. He paused. Harold Reed should chair it. And there's a man named Terrence in the transmission bay, 14 years. Knows every system we service, and he cares about accuracy over being right. Those are different things. He should be on it. Something shifted in her face. Harold would do it. Harold has been doing the informal version of it for 30 years. You'd just be giving it structure and authority. She looked at her hands, then back at him. What do you want in return? He'd thought about how to say this. Had rehearsed it slightly in the car, which was not his usual approach, but felt appropriate given the specificity of what he needed it to mean. I want to be hired as Director of Technical Operations, because I am the most qualified person for that role given the shop's specific gaps, not because a video made it necessary, not because the board needs a PR answer. He held her gaze. If the reason I'm hired is the video, I'm a solution to your problem. If the reason I'm hired is my qualifications, I'm an asset to the company. Those are different jobs. Sandra Mercer looked at him for a long moment, and the thing on her face was not the managed expression of a person running a calculation. It was the expression of a person recognizing something true. The reason you're hired, she said, is that you identified a flaw in our technical culture in approximately 48 hours of unemployment and came back with a structural solution. And because your accuracy rate is 25 points higher than our current standard, and I cannot in good conscience continue running 73.1% when 98.3 exists, and I know it. A pause. And because Harold Reed called me at 8 this morning, I didn't call him. He called me and said the shop runs worse without you. Not worse like slower. Worse like the guys don't learn anything. Anthony looked at her. He said the same thing to me, he said. I know. He told me he was going to. A pause. 30 years. He's been doing this for 30 years. Anthony thought about Harold's hand on the toolbox. The way he'd held it out here. Take this. It's yours. I kept it for you. The simplicity of that. The 30 years of that kind of keeping. He knows things, Anthony said. Yes, Sandra agreed. He does. She put out her hand. He looked at it. He looked at her. He thought about Zara's question from a few mornings ago: if you can help people without going away, why wouldn't you? He thought about the olive drab toolbox in his car, and the approach vector ghost on an erased whiteboard, and the text from Lorraine that read "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," and the note he'd written at a garden center, east-facing window if you have one. He took her hand. Something in her settled visibly, measurably, the way a structure settles when the load is distributed correctly. "There's one more thing," he said. He hadn't planned to say this. Would you treat them with kindness? But it was true, and it was owed, and he was apparently spending the week in the company of people who had taught him what owed things looked like when you paid them. I should have explained the technique. When you asked what I was doing, I started to, and then I read the room and stopped. That was a mistake. My read of the room was correct, but my response to it was wrong. He met her eyes. I knew I was right, and I let you walk away rather than make the case. That's not something I want to do in this building going forward. Sandra Mercer looked at him. "Noted," she said. "Would you treat them with kindness?" And then, because she was apparently also keeping accounts this week, I should have asked before I concluded. "That's not something I want to do in this building going forward either." With kindness? The afternoon light came through the window at the same low slant it came through his kitchen window at this time of year. Down below, the shop was doing its mid-afternoon thing, the sounds of tools and engines and the specific rhythm of people who knew what they were doing moving through the work. Anthony looked down at it. He thought, there are things I know how to do that could make this better. And for the first time in 3 years, the thought didn't arrive with its usual companion, the inventory of what that knowing had cost, and whether the cost had been worth anything. It arrived on its own, clean, practical. Just, there are things I know, and there was a place for them. "I'll need my workstation back," he said. "It'll be ready tomorrow morning," Sandra said. "And Harold chairs the evaluation committee with Terence." Harold chairs the evaluation committee with Terence. He nodded, stood, picked up his jacket. "I have to pick up my daughter at 3:15. Of course." He went down the stairs, through the shop. Harold was at his station, and watched him walk through, and Anthony gave him one nod as he passed, and Harold returned it, the particular efficiency of two people who have already said the necessary things and understand that repetition would diminish them. He drove to the school. The afternoon was cool. The sky the specific blue of October in Atlanta, and the pickup line was what it always was, a long patient coil of vehicles and parents on phones, and the universal low-grade tension of people who have somewhere to be after this. Zara came out at 3:18, backpack over one shoulder, looking for him in the line with the focused scan of someone who had learned very young to locate her person in a crowd. She found him, walked to the car, got in, buckled. "How was school?" "Fine. We finished the weather unit. I got the pressure differential question right." She looked at him sideways. "I used the thing you told me about the floor of the ocean." "You extrapolated." "I extrapolated. Would you treat them with kindness?" She said the word with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for the right moment to use it. "My teacher said it was advanced thinking." He let himself feel that for a moment. Let it just be what it was, without the inventory, without the accounting. "We're having mac and cheese tonight," he said. "I owe you from Monday." "I know. I've been keeping track." She reached into her backpack, pulled out a small folded piece of paper and held it out without looking at him, eyes forward, composed. "I made you something." He took it, unfolded it at the next red light. A drawing. A person with a wrench and another person standing beside them. A sun in the corner, yellow, bigger than realistic suns, but exactly the right size for a drawing made by a person who wanted to be sure you saw it. Underneath in careful print, "My dad fixes things." He held it for 3 seconds. Then the light changed. He drove. He didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would be better than what she'd already put on the paper. "My dad fixes things." Not "my dad was a hero." Not "my dad knows things nobody else knows." "My dad fixes things." The work. The ordinary, repeated, necessary work of finding what's broken and making it function. He put the drawing on the dashboard. Drove home. And the sun stayed in the corner of the paper where she'd drawn it. Exactly the right size. Bigger than real. Visible from wherever you were looking. The board meeting happened on a Thursday. Sandra had called it for 9 a.m. Would you treat them with kindness? And by 8:53 all 8 members were seated, which was itself a statement. These were people who arrived late to things when they wanted to demonstrate that their time was the organizing principle of any room, and they were early today. Raymond Harris sat at the head of the table, 67, silver at his temples. The kind of man who had built enough authority over enough decades that he wore it the way other people wore their skin, not displayed, just present. He had a folder in front of him that he hadn't opened yet. Anthony was not in the meeting. That had been his condition, and she had honored it without negotiating. He was in the shop, standing near Harold's station with a cup of coffee. Harold was at his workstation, working while he talked, which was how Harold worked. Terence, Harold said from the transmission bay, 14 years, knows every system we service and doesn't care about being right, only about being accurate. Those are different things. They are, Anthony agreed. And you want someone who's been wrong in front of the team and recovered from it. Would you treat them with kindness? People who haven't been wrong in front of the team yet are dangerous on evaluation committees. They protect conclusions instead of testing them. Anthony drank his coffee and thought about the specific truth of that, the way certainty that hasn't been tested gets confused for competence. He'd seen it operationally. He'd seen it in this building. He'd seen it in himself, at specific moments he didn't revisit often but also didn't pretend hadn't happened. The third seat, Harold said. Yeah, you. Anthony looked at him. Harold was still working, not looking at him. You're not going to be on the committee officially. You're going to be above the committee officially. But you need to be in those evaluations, sitting there, when the team debates. Not as the authority, as the person who knows the most and also knows how to make other people think better. He set the wrench down. This time he left it. That's a specific skill, you have it. Most people don't know they have it until someone tells them. Anthony said, Who told you? Harold picked up his coffee. A man named Calvin Bates, 1987. I'd been here 4 years and I thought I knew everything. Calvin was retiring, and he pulled me aside and said, Harold, you know more than you think and less than you need to. And then he left. Harold drank. Took me 6 more years to understand what he meant. So I'm skipping 6 years for you. Anthony was quiet a moment. He thought about the approach of that, the specific generosity of it, giving someone the version of an understanding that cost you time to earn, without requiring them to pay the same time. Not robbing them of the learning. Just handing them the direction so they could find the learning faster. Thank you, he said. Harold waved a hand, dismissive in the way that meant he'd heard it, and it had landed, and the conversation was over, because Harold Reed operated on the economy of necessary words. He picked up the wrench. Upstairs in the conference room, Sandra was standing. She had not prepared slides. She had prepared 3 documents, and her own voice, which she had discovered in the past 72 hours, was a more honest instrument than she'd been allowing it to be. She had rehearsed once in her apartment at 6 a.m., and then stopped rehearsing because rehearsed honesty sounds like managed honesty, and what she needed to deliver today was the version that had no management in it. Harris opened the meeting. Standard procedure. He summarized the situation, the termination, the video, the current public and board response in the flat tone of a chairman who is marshalling facts before positions. 3 other board members had already formed positions. She could see it in how they sat. Arms crossed or forward-leaning, the 2 opposed postures of people who have decided and are waiting for the room to catch up. Terry Coleman, 70, the retired general who had joined the board 4 years ago and who had the specific quality of stillness that comes from spending decades in environments where unnecessary movement telegraphs uncertainty, sat with his hands flat on the table and said nothing. He was waiting. Harris finished the summary. Looked at Sandra. The floor is yours. She stood. I terminated Anthony Wilson on Tuesday morning, she said, in front of the full shift. Publicly, immediately, without asking him to explain the technique he was using. I want to be precise about why, not because I was certain he was wrong, but because I wasn't certain he was right, and I needed to appear certain. Those are different reasons, and only one of them is defensible. The room was very still. The technique he was using has a documented accuracy rate of 98.3%. Our standard protocol runs 73.1. I found this out the night I terminated him, reviewing the security footage. She paused, not for effect, for accuracy, to make sure the next sentence was exactly what she meant. I sat with that information, and I made a choice not to act on it immediately, because acting on it with kindness would have required admitting the same day that I had made the wrong call, and I was not ready to do that in front of this board. One of the board members, the one with his arms crossed, who had been building an expression, started to speak. Sandra kept going. I'm telling you this now because the mistake was mine, and the accounting is also mine. And if I give you a version of this that protects my position rather than describes what happened, I'm asking you to make a governance decision based on incomplete information. That's not fair to the company, and it's not fair to the man I wronged. She placed the first document on the table. This is a proposal for a technical evaluation protocol, a formal process for assessing non-standard methods before rejecting them. 30-day review cycle. Evaluated by senior technicians with more than 15 years tenure, chaired by Harold Reed, who has been doing the informal version of this for 3 decades, and who identified Anthony Wilson as exceptional on day 1, without being asked and without being listened to. She placed the second document. This is a job description for Director of Technical Operations. Anthony Wilson's qualifications against the requirements. I've included his service record, the portions cleared for civilian review, and his work history at this shop, including the specific diagnostic calls he made that exceeded documented expectations in accuracy and speed. I'm proposing this position be offered to him because he is the most qualified candidate by a significant margin, not because the video made it convenient. She placed the third document. This is my own performance review, written by me, about me, for the period covering the past 24 months. I've included the decision to terminate Wilson as an error of judgment caused by a structural pressure I was responding to, rather than addressing. The structural pressure being the expectation from this board, from this room, that I demonstrate certainty at all times, or face the conclusion that I lack leadership capability. She looked at Harris, then at the man with crossed arms, then at Coleman, who still hadn't moved. That expectation is not wrong. Certainty matters in a leader. But there is a category of certainty that comes from asking questions rather than avoiding them, and I have not been building that category. I've been avoiding the questions that might reveal gaps, because gaps are what this board has been watching for since my father died. She stopped. Let that sentence sit in the room. I'm done avoiding the questions, including that one. Silence. Harris turned the first document over. Read the top page. Turn to the second page. This took 3 minutes, and the room held the 3 minutes the way rooms hold things when something that has been building has finally arrived, and everyone is recalibrating. Coleman spoke. He'd waited for Harris to finish. He had that kind of patience, the kind that isn't passive but strategic, the patience of someone who has learned to speak after the room has settled rather than into the unsettled center of it. Operation Black Tide, Coleman said. He had a voice that was quiet and precise, not dramatic, just carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades in rooms where weight mattered. I'm aware of it. I can't speak to classified details, but I can speak to what I know, which is that the operation required a decision twice that most pilots would not have made, and the outcome of those decisions was 14 people who went home. The board member with crossed arms had uncrossed them. Coleman continued, I want to be clear that the decision before this board is not whether Anthony Wilson is a hero. He's asked not to be hired as one, and I respect that. The decision is whether this company is the kind of organization that builds its culture around the best practices available to it, or around the practices that are easiest to defend. He looked at Harris. I vote for the proposal as presented. All 3 documents. Harris looked at the room. The board member, who had started to speak, Kenneth, 58, commercial real estate background, looked at the 3 documents, then at Sandra, then at Harris. The public exposure is significant. The boycott hashtag is still active. From a reputation management perspective, rehiring Wilson is not a reputation management decision, Sandra said. Clear. Not aggressive. Just clear. In the way that a line drawn in the right place is clear. If we rehire Anthony Wilson because the video exists, we're not building an ethical company. We're building a PR responsive company, and those are different things, and one of them is fragile. She held Kenneth's gaze. I'm not asking this board to fix the reputation. I'm asking it to make the decision that's actually right and let the reputation follow from that. Kenneth was quiet. Harris went around the table, not formally, just with his eyes, reading the room the way 67 years of reading rooms teaches you to read them. Then he said, all in favor. 7 hands. Kenneth's went up last. A half-second hesitation, but it went up. Harris nodded, set his folder down, looked at Sandra. You mentioned Harold Reed chairs the evaluation committee. Yes, I'd like to meet with Harold Reed. Sandra almost smiled. He'll tell you things you won't like. Good. Harris closed the folder. I've been told things I liked for too long. Get me 30 minutes with Harold Reed before end of week. Sandra went downstairs. Anthony was still near Harold's station. He heard her on the stairs and turned. She crossed the shop floor. Harold kept working, which was Harold's version of giving people privacy. He stayed present and stayed occupied, which meant the conversation could happen in the open without being public. She stood in front of Anthony, looked at him steadily. It passed, she said. Unanimous. He studied her face. How? I told them the truth. All of it. She paused, including the part where I sat on the truth for a day because I wasn't ready to pay for it yet. He absorbed this. That took something. Yes. She didn't say it like she wanted credit. She said it like a person confirming the accuracy of an observation. Harold, she looked over at the older man, who continued working without acknowledging that his name had been spoken. Though Anthony could see from the slight shift in his shoulders that he'd heard, Harris wants 30 minutes with you before Friday. Harold said, without looking up, Tell him Thursday afternoon. I have a transmission diagnostic in the morning. Sandra's mouth did the thing it had been doing more frequently in the past few days, the corner moving, the almost smile, the expression that lived just below the surface, and came up when something was true in a way she hadn't planned for. She was, Anthony had concluded, a person who found humor in accuracy rather than in performance, and that was a kind of humor he understood. Thursday afternoon, she told Harold. He can bring lunch, Harold said. I'll eat while he talks. Saves time. Anthony drank his coffee, said nothing. Would you treat them with kindness? But he filed the moment Harold Reed, the 30-year man who had kept the toolbox and named the problem, and told the truth to 2 different people who needed it in 2 different ways. He thought about, with kindness. He thought about Calvin Bates in 1987 telling a young Harold that he knew more than he thought and less than he needed. He thought about the chain of it, the passing forward, the specific human with kindness, by which understanding moves through time. The meeting with Sandra happened in his office, the room on the second floor with the window that looked down at the shop. She sat in the chair he'd put beside his desk, angled the same geometry he'd used in pre-flight briefings when he wanted his team to think rather than defer. The evaluation committee, he said. I want it running by next Monday. Harold said, he can have the first meeting by next Wednesday. Monday. If we wait until Wednesday, it becomes a next week thing, and next week things become next month things. He looked at her directly. I've seen what happens to structural changes when they lose momentum. They become documents. She looked back. Monday. And I want every senior technician to have access to my notes on the military protocols, not as training material yet, just as reading. Let them sit with it before they're formally evaluated. People learn better when they've had time to be curious first. I'll have it distributed by tomorrow. One more thing. He stopped, considered how to say this precisely. When a new technique comes in for evaluation and it outperforms the standard, the manual updates within 30 days. Not reviewed for 30 days. Updated. The review is for determining if it outperforms. Once that's determined, the update is not optional. Sandra said, You're worried the organization will review forever and update never. Organizations have momentum toward what they already know. The protocol has to be stronger than the momentum, or the protocol becomes decorative. She was quiet for a moment. That's the most accurate description of how we've been running I've heard since my father died. He didn't respond to that. There wasn't a response that wouldn't have been smaller than the statement. The protocol will be binding, she said. I'll put it in the governance documents, not just the operations manual. If it's in governance, it requires a board vote to change, which means it can't be quietly revised when it becomes inconvenient. He looked at her. That was a more comprehensive solution than he'd asked us, which meant she'd thought further ahead on this than the conversation required. That works, he said. She stood to go. At the door, she stopped. I talked to my father a lot in the first month after he died. Not in a complicated way. Just out loud, alone. Telling him things. I told him about the board meetings, mostly. About all the ways they were waiting for me to fail. A pause. I stopped because it started to feel like I was asking for permission to be afraid. And he wouldn't have given me that. He'd have asked me what I was going to do about it. She met Anthony's eyes. I think I've been confusing his standard with the board's expectation. They're not the same thing. He never cared what they thought. He cared what was right. Anthony said, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." She actually smiled. The full version, which arrived in her eyes before her mouth, and lasted longer and had nothing managed about it. He was impossible, she said. He was also completely right about most things, which made it worse. She turned back to the door. Thursday, I have a call with a journalist who wants to do a piece on all of this. I'm going to tell the same story I told the board. All of it. All of it. Including the part where I didn't act on what I knew for a day. If I leave that part out, the rest of it is PR. She paused, and it needs to not be PR. It needs to be a record of what actually happened, so that the next time someone in shop somewhere gets fired for being excellent, there's a version of this story in the world that tells the truth about how that goes, and what it costs, and what it takes to fix it. He thought about that. The scope of it. Not just this shop, not just this week, but the idea that what happened here could become a thing that mattered to people who would never know anyone's name, who would just recognize the shape of it. Write it the same way you told the board, he said. No softening. No softening, she agreed and left. 3 days after he officially started, Lorraine Mitchell came to the shop. She arrived at 10 in the morning in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a light jacket, which told him this was not an official visit. He saw her from the windows. Before she came in, standing outside the bay doors with her hands in her pockets, looking at the building with the expression of someone who has been thinking about a place before arriving at it. He went downstairs, she said. I'm in Atlanta for 2 more days. Reassigned back to Jacksonville end of the week. I wanted to... She stopped, reconsidered, started again. I wanted to see where you work. He looked at her, then at the shop behind him. Why? Because you came out of here, into that parking lot. And I've been thinking about the gap between those two things, and I wanted to close it. See what the in-between looks like. She looked at him. If that's strange, I can... It's not strange. He held the door. Come in. She came in. Would you treat them with kindness? He walked her through the shop the way he'd begun to walk new technicians through not a tour. Exactly, more like an introduction. The way you introduce people to a place that has its own character by letting the character speak, rather than narrating it. Would you treat them with kindness? He showed her the evaluation committee structure on the whiteboard in the break room. Harold had set it up Tuesday, first meeting Wednesday as originally planned because Harold had been unmoved by Anthony's Monday argument, which Anthony had decided to respect because picking your battles with Harold Reed was itself a management skill. Lorraine studied the whiteboard. You built this in a week. I proposed it. Sandra is building it. Harold is making it work. He paused. That's the accurate distribution. She looked at him sideways. You could take more credit. I'm not in the credit business. She turned back to the board. No, you're not. She said it like she'd already known and was confirming. Bryant wanted me to tell you Thompson's recovery is ahead of schedule. He's being cleared for limited duty next month. Anthony nodded. His daughter sent you something. Lorraine reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, handed it over. He unfolded it. A drawing. A helicopter rendered in purple crayon flying over what appeared to be water blue scribble. Enthusiastic, the water of someone who has never seen anything do the sea wrong. Two figures on the shore. One tall, one small. Above them, in the careful print of a young child, "Thank you, A6. He stood there. Lorraine was quiet. She'd seen what was on the paper. She gave him the silence. He thought about Reeves and Carver and Dominguez. Not the way he usually thought to do about them, not with the weight of the ledger, not with the three names standing in for everything he couldn't undo. He thought about them the way Bryant had begun to help him think. The way they had made a choice, and he had made choices, and all of those things existed in the same moment without one canceling the other. Thompson's daughter had drawn a helicopter and two people on a shore. She had written "thank you" in the careful print of someone who understood that thank you was important, even if she didn't yet fully understand why. That was what had been saved. Not a file, not a statistic. A child's certainty that she had a father to write thank you notes about. He folded the drawing, put it in his shirt pocket. "Tell Thompson," he started. Stopped. Tried again. "Tell him he flew a good ship. You know what that means." Lorraine knew what it meant. "I'll tell him." He looked at her. "You've been doing this for how long?" "Naval aviation. 12 years. You're good at it." She tilted her head slightly. "How would you know? You've only seen me in crisis situations. Because crisis situations show you who people are when their performance can't be managed. You don't manage yours." He said it flatly. Factual. The way he'd say, "The substrate is high silica limestone, and that's why the scan missed it." A thing that is true because it is measurable. You think fast and you explain clearly and you make other people around you more accurate. That's rare. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you. It's not a compliment. It's an observation." "I know." She almost smiled. "That's why I'm thanking you for it." He walked her back to the bay door. She shook his hand at the exit formal. Like the first time, which he'd come to understand was not coldness, but her version of respect. The precision of someone who means what she does and doesn't want physical gesture to outpace what's actually been established between people. She left. He stood at the bay door a moment. The October Street. The fiddle leaf fig on Mrs. Collins's balcony 2 miles north, already turning toward the east-facing light she'd moved it to, after reading his note. The drawing in his shirt pocket. Thompson's daughter and her purple helicopter, and the water that was more enthusiastic than accurate. He went back inside. The board meeting with Harold happened Thursday afternoon. Anthony was not with kindness. Anthony was not in the room. Harris had asked for the conversation to be between himself and Harold had agreed, which Anthony respected because Harold understood that some conversations produce better results without the person being discussed in them. He found out what happened from Harold afterward, in the parking lot. Harold pulling on his jacket at end of shift. "Decent man," Harold said. "Harris listens better than he talks, which is unusual for a man who's been in charge of things for 30 years. Harold zipped his jacket. He asked me what I'd seen the day Anthony Wilson was hired. Anthony looked at him. I told him I'd seen a man who diagnosed a transmission problem from the parking lot before he came inside, heard the idle at 40 feet, told me what was wrong before he'd been given the keys to his workstation. Harold picked up his bag. Harris asked why I didn't report it up the chain. I told him because the chain wasn't built to find what works. It was built to stop what doesn't. Those are two different things. He stopped. Looked at Anthony directly. He wrote that down. Verbatim. Which means it's going somewhere. I don't know where. But somewhere. Anthony thought about the chain of it again. Calvin Bates. Harold. The 30-year man who had kept the toolbox, and then told the truth to a chairman who listened better than he talked. And wherever Harris was going to take what Harold had said. "Good," Anthony said. Also Harold said, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "He's buying lunch next Thursday. Wants another 30 minutes. I said fine, but I have a brake job in the afternoon and if he runs long I'm ending it." Harold walked toward the lot. Then, from over his shoulder, without turning, "He's going to ask you something too. Eventually. I don't know what. But I could see him figuring out what it was." Anthony watched him go. The evaluation committee's first formal review happened the following Wednesday. Terence, the 14-year man Harold had named, first had submitted a diagnostic procedure he'd been using informally for brake system analysis. Not military in origin. Developed by Terence himself, over several years of noticing a pattern in the way brake fade presented in high-mileage vehicles in Atlanta's specific combination of heat and traffic conditions. He'd been using it quietly on his own, not submitting it formally because the mechanism for formal submission hadn't existed. Now it did. Harold presented it to the committee Wednesday morning. Anthony sat in the back of the room, not at the table, in a chair at the wall with a cup of coffee, in exactly the configuration Harold had described. Present, not authoritative. Available if the team's thinking stalled, unnecessary if it didn't. The team didn't stall. Would you treat them with kindness? They went at Terence's procedure with the thoroughness of people who had been given permission to take something seriously and were taking it seriously. They tested it against the documented standard, ran 3 scenarios, debated the edge cases. Terence treat them with kindness. Terence answered questions with the patience of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation for years and had the answers already prepared because the questions were the ones he'd asked himself in the process of building the thing. At the end of the meeting, Harold said, "All in favor of recommending protocol adoption." 5 hands. Unanimous. Anthony didn't raise his hand because he wasn't at the table. Would you treat them with kindness? But he set his coffee cup down and thought about a 30-year technician who had kept a toolbox and a 14-year technician who had built something quietly and a structure that was now the mechanism by which both of those things could matter. Terence caught him in the hallway afterward. He was 41 and moved with the specific confidence of a person who has spent years being quietly certain about something and has just had that certainty formally confirmed. "You built this," Terence said. Anthony shook his head. "Harold built it. I described a problem. Harold fixed it." Terence looked at him for a moment. "Harold said you'd say that." What did Harold say back? A pause. "He said you'd built it by knowing what you didn't need to control, which is the same thing, just from a different angle." Anthony thought about that. "Harold's usually right," he said. "Yeah." Terence started down the hall. Stopped. Turned. "For what it's worth, I heard your diagnostic call in the transmission bay 3 weeks ago, when you said the valve timing on that F-150 was off. Before you opened the hood." He shook his head. "I've been doing this 14 years. I need the hood open." Anthony said, "You'll get there, maybe. Or maybe that's just yours." Terence said it without envy. As a fact. The fact of different people having different capabilities, which was not a hierarchy. It was just accurate. "Either way, I'm glad you're here." He left. Anthony stood in the hallway. He thought about the first morning, the SUV, the gauge from the olive drab box, the 30-foot walk and the particular silence that followed it. He thought about what had been between that morning and this one Bryant in a small room, Lorraine in a pharmacy line, Harold holding out the toolbox, Sandra at his kitchen table with her jacket in her lap saying, "I forgot that," with the flatness of genuine reckoning. He thought, "I almost didn't go back. The second time. I sat in the cockpit and I almost turned around. And I didn't. Not because he was brave in some uncomplicated way. Because the alternative was something his body understood, at a level below decision, was not something he could carry. Some things you can put down. Some things you can't with kindness. Some you can't put down because putting them down would mean becoming the person who put them down. And that person doesn't have a version forward that works. He'd gone back because going back was the only version forward that worked. He was here because being here was the only version forward that worked. He went upstairs. Sandra knocked on his office door at 4:30. She came in, stood at the window looking down at the shop, which she'd been doing more often lately, not checking, not monitoring, just looking. The way you look at something you're trying to understand differently than you understood it before. "The journalist piece runs Monday," she said. "How is it? Honest?" She asked me twice if I was sure I wanted to include the part about sitting on the information. I said yes both times. She turned from the window. "It's going to be uncomfortable." "For who?" "For me. For the board. for the way people in this industry think about what leadership looks like. She paused. I thought about softening it. There's a version of the story where I just made a procedural error and corrected it quickly. It's not inaccurate exactly. It just omits the part where I knew and waited. And you're running the full version. Because the omission is the lesson. The part where I knew and waited is the part that's actually useful to people. Because it's the part everyone does and nobody talks about. She looked at him. You told me that. In your kitchen. I said it in my kitchen, he agreed. Same idea. She sat in the chair beside his desk. Harris is going to propose a governance change at the next board meeting. A formal process for anonymous technical feedback from the floor to the board level. No manager filter. Anthony looked at her. Harold told him. Harold told him that the chain wasn't built to find what works. It was built to stop what doesn't. And that those are two different things, and the gap between them was where most of the company's real capability was sitting uncollected. She paused. Harris called it the best business intelligence he'd heard in 30 years of board service. Anthony thought about Harold in the parking lot. He wrote it down. Verbatim. The chain again. The passing forward. The thing that moves through people when the conditions are right. Good, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, can I ask you something? He waited. When you were flying before. She was choosing the words carefully. Not because she was being diplomatic. Because she was being accurate. Were you happy? He thought about that. The real answer, rather than the convenient one. Happy isn't the right frame for what it was. I was completely used. Every capability I had was being used completely. There's a kind of satisfaction in that it's closer to rightness than happiness. Like all the pieces are in the places they fit. And then you left. And then Zara needed me more than the work needed me. He paused. And I discovered that being completely used for the right thing is the same feeling regardless of what the right thing is. Turns out the feeling isn't specific to aviation. She looked at him. You have it now, she said. Not a question. Getting there. She nodded. Sat with that, then stood up. There's one more thing. It's not business. She reached into her jacket pocket, held out her hand. In her palm, the challenge coin. Navy Special Warfare. Gold trim. The one Lorraine had given Zara at the pharmacy. Zara gave me this, Sandra said. When I came to your apartment, I've been thinking about whether I should keep it. And I've decided the answer is no, not because she didn't mean it. She clearly meant it completely, but because. She stopped. Found the sentence. Because the reason she gave it to me was that she believed I was trying to do the right thing. And I think the right thing, in this case, is to give it back so it can be where it was earned. She set it on the corner of his desk. Anthony looked at it. The coin was heavy for its size. Always had been. He'd forgotten that. Had carried it so long in so many contexts that the weight had become part of his hand and then stopped registering. Now, looking at it on the desk, he remembered that it was heavy. He picked it up, turned it once. She'll say you should keep it, he said. I know. She'll be very serious about it. She's always serious about things she's decided. Sandra almost smiled. She gets that from somewhere. She said it lightly, not pointedly, just the observation of someone who had spent enough time near a person to see the through lines. What do I tell her? Tell her that the best way to honor a thing is to remember what it was given for. Sandra looked at him. She'll ask what it was given for. Tell her it was given for trying. And that trying is not a lesser version of succeeding. It's the thing that makes succeeding possible. She considered that. Stewed. I'll tell her. She left. He sat for a moment in the office, the low light coming through the window, the shop below winding down, the sounds of tools being put away, the bay lights going off in sequence, the particular end-of-shift rhythm he'd been hearing from this window for 3 weeks, and had already begun to know the way. You know rhythms that repeat, by feeling rather than by listening. He opened the desk drawer, looked at the coin. He thought about Reeves and Carver and Dominguez. He thought about it the way he'd been practicing, not the way that pulled him under, not the way that convinced him the living was borrowed time. The way they had chosen what they chose, and he had made what he'd made, and all of those things existed in the same moment, one's canceling the other. The loss and the gift in the same space, Not collapsing into each other. Not canceling each other. Just both there. Both real. He thought about Thompson's daughter with her purple helicopter and her enthusiastic, inaccurate water, and the two figures she'd drawn on the shore. He closed the drawer. He packed up, went downstairs. The shop was nearly empty. Harold was the last senior. Tech left, which was always the case. Harold stayed until the lights were right, and the floor was right, and the workstations were staged for morning. Not because he was required to, because 30 years had built in him the habit of leaving things better than he found them. Anthony stopped. Harold. Harold was pulling on his jacket. "You're here late. You're here later." Harold zipped the jacket, said nothing, because that was accurate, and didn't need a response. "Calvin Bates," Anthony said. "The man who told you what you know more than you think." Harold looked at him. What about him? Did he know what he was doing? When he said it, Harold considered. Probably. He was a smart man. He picked up his bag. "Why?" "Because I want to know if it was deliberate." The passing it on. Harold stood there a moment. Then, I think with people like Calvin, the deliberate and the instinctive become the same thing eventually. They've done it long enough that doing it right doesn't require deciding to. He started toward the door. "You'll get there," Anthony said. "I'm already there." Harold stopped, turned, looked at him. Then he nodded. Once. The particular nod that Harold reserved for things he considered, settled, not quick, not dismissive. The nod that carried the full weight of agreement rather than just the gesture of it. He left. Anthony turned off the office light, went down, through the shop, out the side door. The parking lot was almost empty. The October air was cool and direct, the kind of cool that makes outlines sharp and distances honest. He stood for a moment outside the bay door before getting in his car. He thought about the first morning. The cool of that morning, different the cool of a man who had just been reduced in front of witnesses and was walking out into weather with $38 and some change and a daughter who needed medicines. This cool was the same temperature. Probably. October in Atlanta was consistent. But he stood in it differently. Not because the circumstances had resolved, they were resolving. There was a difference. There was still the ongoing arithmetic of a single parent, navigating the gap between income and expense. Still the appointments and the medications and the math that never fully simplified. Resolving wasn't resolved. But he stood in it differently. Because this time the cool was just the cool and not also everything else. He drove to the grocery store on Moreland. They were out of apples again. Zara went through apples with an efficiency that still surprised him. He bought apples. He bought the cereal and the soup and the pasta and a small bunch of sunflowers because the grocery store had them near the checkout. And Zara had mentioned once, months ago, that she liked them with kindness, that she liked flowers on the kitchen table because they were something that was just for being looked at and not for anything useful. And he'd filed that and had never acted on it and was acting on it now. He drove home, climbed the stairs. He knocked twice, his signal, then used his key. Zara was at the table. Homework. Inhaler 3 inches from the edge. She looked up. "You brought flowers." "But table." She looked at them, then at him. "Why?" "Because you said you liked them." She thought about when she'd said that. "I didn't think you were listening." "I'm always listening." She accepted this, got up, got the vase from the cabinet, the one with the chip in the lip, the one she'd once taped with a small piece of Scotch tape and called fixed, and it was. She filled it at the sink, put the flowers in, set it on the table, stepped back, looked at it. "Good," she said, with the satisfaction of someone who has confirmed a hypothesis. He made dinner. She ate and did the remaining homework and asked him 2 questions about long division, and one about why clouds were different shapes, which he answered accurately because he knew the aerodynamics of it, and because she wanted the accurate answer, not the simplified one. She'd always wanted the accurate answer. After dinner, she sat on the couch with her book. He sat at the other end, not reading. Just there. She read, he sat. The apartment was quiet, in the specific way of 2 people who don't need to fill silence, because the silence itself is sufficient, is even preferred. Would you treat them with kindness? Is the thing that exists between people when they have settled into the shape of each other and don't need to keep demonstrating that they belong together. After a while she looked up, closed her book on her finger. Dad. Yeah. She looked at him steadily, the direct eyes, the gaze that had been direct since before she had words for what she was looking at. Are you okay now? He thought about the accurate answer, not the simplified one. Getting there, he said. She looked at him, through him slightly, the way she sometimes looked past the surface to the thing behind it, that she'd identified long before he'd realized she was looking. Then she looked back at her book, put her finger on the page. Okay, she said. And that was enough. For her, for him, for the evening, for the particular quiet they'd built, across 3 apartments and 8 years, and every variation of difficult that their specific life had arranged for them. It was enough. Outside, the city made its nighttime sounds traffic, dropping an octave, distant sirens, the bass from someone's music 2 streets over, the specific acoustic signature of Atlanta, at 9 p.m., that Anthony had memorized over 3 years the way you memorize the sound of a place that is yours. She turned a page. He sat, and in his shirt pocket, folded back along the creases the way he'd received it, Thompson's daughter's drawing of a helicopter over enthusiastic blue water, with 2 figures, on the shore. On the shore, that was the thing he kept coming back to. Not the helicopter, not the letters. The 2 of them on the shore. 2 people standing on solid ground after something that could have gone the other way. That was the whole picture, really. The version that was true. Not the hero version, not the version that lived in viral comment sections, or journalist pieces or governance documents. Just the version that a child understood with a purple crayon and a piece of paper. 2 people on the shore. Both of them there. Both of them standing. That was enough to draw. That was, it turned out, the whole thing. She turned another page. Anthony sat in the quiet of the apartment that was theirs. Let the evening be what it was. Didn't reach for the next thing, or the past thing, or the versions of either that had occupied him for 3 years, with the particular weight of things carried without acknowledgement. He sat. He breathed. And the October, cool outside pressed gently at the windows, and the city went about its business, and the inhaler sat 3 inches from the edge of the coffee table, and she read her book, and the sunflowers on the kitchen table were just for looking at. And that was, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, entirely sufficient. Not perfect, not resolved, not the version of fine that was actually fine. Just sufficient, real, present, his, which was, he had come to understand, the closest thing to peace that was available to a person who has been where he's been, and chosen what he's chosen, and lost what he's lost, and is still, in the end, in the apartment, on the couch, with the people he loves, and the quiet that belongs to them. Still here. Still here. That was the whole of it. The entire ordinary, extraordinary thing. Still here.